Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
If you've just tuned in, you're listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. You've tuned in to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. In case you're wondering, it's Thursday, February 21st, 2019. It's amazing. We are fast and furious into 2019, and it seems like we just exited out of a year of politics and entering into another season of politics. And I don't know whether it's just me and I wasn't aware of it as much growing up. There were other things obviously on my mind, but now it's like every time I turn around, there's something going on political. And in keeping with the topic of today's show, I'm going to try to stay on topic, but it's connecting the dots between race, power, and politics. Race, power, and politics. So there's a couple of things that I want to touch base on, especially I will just like to preference this by saying the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So let me start by saying I think that anyone that goes into politics, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or the national level, is really a brave soul. It's really a brave soul. I think it requires a tremendous amount of focus, as well as resources, not only of your time, your family's time, financial resources. I mean, every way that you could think of in the current environment that we live in, between social media and everything that can happen with cell phones and videos. I mean, you're constantly, even before you decide to become a candidate, you are out there for the world to see and unfortunately to judge. So as I moved back into Savannah, for those of you that are listening for the first time and don't know me, I was born and raised here in Savannah, Georgia, and I'm thrilled to be back home in Savannah. But when I moved from Savannah, I really moved away before I went through what I call my adult years. I moved away right after graduating out of college. So moving back in as an adult, it's been a very interesting process to see how the city of Savannah is governed, what makes it different, because it is a small city compared to some municipalities. And it was interesting today. This week I ran into someone that I was saying how it's great to be back in a small city, and they mentioned to me that for them, coming from the city that they were coming from, they considered Savannah to be a large city in a much faster pace than what they were used to. So, it's all relative. It's a matter of, what have we gotten adjusted to, and what do we consider a fast pace, slow pace? So one of the things I wanted to share with you before we get into this topic of race, power, and politics is, I wanted to make sure that I was clear on how Savannah is governed as a city, and when was the current format adopted. So here's some interesting tidbits for you. The Savannah's city government adopted a council manager form of government in 1954. So the current city council, this is for the city of Savannah, consists of the mayor and 8 aldermen. Now, I'm pulling this off of their website. And the responsibilities for the current city council is to levy taxes, ordinances, adopts the annual budget, and appoints the city manager. And then it goes on to say the city manager is responsible for carrying out the policies and programs established by council, recommending the annual budget and work programs, appointing bureau and department heads, and exercising general supervision and control over all employees of the city. So I've gotten adjusted to hearing the terms alderman and city council person interchangeably. And for the city of Savannah, the alderman term comes from English law, just kind of a little way back, a little history there. And alderman is a member of a municipal assembly or council. So I think that's why we hear them interchangeably, at least as far as I can tell. So one of the things that was of interest to me in the structure of our local government in the city of Savannah, because this happens to be for 2019, an election year, it got me to wondering, well, how much money do they make? Because you kind of wonder when you see what they go through, at least I wonder when I see what they go through. It's like, well, what are they putting on the line to be stewards and to provide a service to what I think should be the entire community of Savannah. So all of this is posted on the City of Savannah's website. Now, you may have to dig a little bit to see some of it, but one of the things, since it's an election year, there is a notice that has to be placed based on the Georgia Municipal Election Code that's part of the charter and the incorporation that was approved by the Georgia General Assembly for the city of Savannah. So the city of Savannah is required to post the qualifying fees for the city of Savannah, the municipal elections. And in case you're wondering, those elections are going to be held on Tuesday, November 5th, 2019. So as required by the state, the qualifying fee shall be 3% of the mayor and alderman's salaries. So here's a little math for you. So the mayor's salary is $57,000. That 3% fee is $1,710. The alderman's salary is $25,000 with a qualifying fee of $750. So that gets me to wondering, because sometimes if you follow what happens, especially with your different districts, and depending on how proactive the alderman is for your district, and I would strongly recommend you know who that is if you live in the city of Savannah and haven't been following what your alderman's been talking about. So every now and then I see some postings that catch my attention from the alderman from the district that I'm in. Plus, I don't know, I've been fixated on watching the work sessions for the city council, which is great because you can watch those on Channel 8 here in Savannah, as well as watching the city council meetings. And so I also had the opportunity to go down to city council was it last week, which is one reason why the show for the One Human Nation was pre-recorded. And it was very interesting to be there in that room and to see how things, kind of look a little different when you're there in person than when you're on TV, when you're watching it on TV. So this has been kind of this thought process is, what does it take for someone to engage in this process, whether, especially at the local level, because I think that's where you can really see the impact in changes if you engage in the political process or how you elect to engage at the local level. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to see the impact that you're making at the national level or even sometimes at the state level. That doesn't mean that you give up and don't engage in the process, but I do believe that what happens in your local community, whether it's with the city municipality, whether it's with your school board, with some of your other elected officials, like district attorney, some of the judges. I mean, you can see the impact that they have in your particular community. So what's been interesting to me in Savannah is how the city is divided along the power line that sometimes can be broken down into race and racism. How does the segregation work in the city of Savannah? Because if you look at it on the surface, especially me moving back in, it appears to be a very diverse city. But in any city, in any kind of governance, in any kind of organizational structure, the question is, who has the power? And I think that really comes to play when you start looking at what happens in the election time, what happens during that process cycle, where do you see the power players, what's the message that you hear? And for the longest in the African American community, it was where you would see different politicians go to the churches, and that was kind of the standard thing to do. And of course, you probably never saw them except for at election time, but that was the standard. I don't know how much of that still is part of the engagement process, because there's been there's been more diluting in what happens in the African American churches as it relates to politics. So one of the things that I thought, in looking at the city of Savannah, which is a small city compared to a lot of cities, how does the dynamics, how does that shape with politics? How does that compare to other cities? And the information that I found that was really interesting was from a city that is so much larger than Savannah, but trying to find in how to put things in perspective, because sometimes you think, okay, what's going on in your city, in your community must be the worst thing out there, or you may think it's the best thing out there, or you might not have an opinion one way or the other. And so it's always interesting to me to see, well, how are other cities how are they managed? How are they governed? What kind of challenges do they have? And, what makes Savannah different or the same? So this particular clip we're going to listen to initially comes from something that I came across that is taken from a talk that was held with really breaking down the city of Chicago. And I had no idea of how Chicago was governed, and I did not know it had like 50 wards, so it has like 50 aldermen. So this kind of gives you some perspective if you're thinking, well, maybe we need less aldermen, or do we need more aldermen in the city of Savannah? And if you haven't taken a look at how the districts are broken down in the city of Savannah, I highly encourage you to do that. And again, you can access that information from the City of Savannah's website. So let's just take a listen to how the City of Chicago deals with the power dynamics in politics in a very large city.
Hello, I'm Amanda Moore. I'm the director of the Clearinghouse Community. Welcome to the Advocacy Exchange for October 2018. The Advocacy Exchange is our monthly conversation with advocates advancing change. Both the Advocacy Exchange and the Clearinghouse Community are brought to you by the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, a national leader in advancing justice and opportunity. Keep your eyes on your inbox for that. What kind of local government structure are we talking about here?
Sure. So in Chicago, local control is carried out at the ward level. So we have 50 wards led by aldermen, which in turn means 50 decision makers determining what our communities look like. In comparison to other large cities, this is pretty unique. So for example, New York City has 3 times as many residents as Chicago and 51 city council members. LA has close to 4 million residents. We have close to 3, and they have only 15 city council members. Aldermen themselves have described this power as creating essentially mini fiefdoms throughout the city. And because aldermen have an understandable desire to maintain their political longevity, they are greatly concerned with maintaining the status quo, and therefore greatly influenced by the demands of their constituents. So on its face, this doesn't sound problematic. Aldermen should listen to their voters, right? But when we really dig in, we find that its hyper-local control serves to be a vehicle for the most powerful constituents, so those with money, those with power, those with election clout, to have a greater say in neighborhood-level decisions. And instead of balancing power dynamics, it actually creates imbalances in power and undercuts any ability for citywide planning. And ultimately, it leaves lower income individuals with diluted power in shaping housing decisions that determine where they can live in the city.
So I'm going to pause right there for a minute because, as I mentioned earlier in the show, if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we're really taking a closer look at the connection between race, poverty, politics, and power. And when I look at the city of Savannah, what's very interesting, there is always this conversation of what happens in the historic district, like it's its own entity separate from the rest of the city of Savannah, which in many ways it's perceived that way, and it has some zoning and ordinances specifically for the historical district. So one of the things I think as you listen to this, even though it's talking about the city of Chicago or whatever city you're in, start asking yourself the question, how does this relate to the city that I currently live in?
So the most typical example is as it relates to zoning. Aldermen have an absolute right to downzone so that they're able to take a lot and move it from what may be currently zoned as multifamily residential, or for allowing it, to commercial or single family home. So we see this power, particularly in predominantly white wards in Chicago, being used by the aldermen, and they're very upfront about it. You know, I am doing this to preserve the character of our neighborhood because the character of our neighborhood would not fit for larger multifamily residential.
So even though, again, this is talking about Chicago, I think we hear some of the similar conversations in Savannah, maybe the same in some of the cities that you're listening into. It was definitely the similar type conversations that I would hear when I lived in Texas. And so what's interesting to me of how the narrative around affordable housing and poverty and the role of politics is in some ways very similar from municipality to municipality, no matter what the size of it. And then, we're kind of left with, if you're, want to be engaged at the civic level, the local level, which I think we all should be, it's like you really have to start unpeeling the layers and figuring out, well, number one, how did we get here? Looking at the past, what's the current environment? Why am I hearing the messages that I'm hearing? And how is this going to impact the future? Because as you're listening to some of the conversations that's occurring now in Savannah, it is definitely focused on some of the things that are happening presently and how that's going to impact the future.
What we also see is the aldermen have zoning advisory councils, especially in predominantly white wards, and they are deferring all their zones. And what those constituent groups do is advance their NIMBY interest to either block that affordable housing development or to fundamentally alter it. It may initially be a proposal for family affordable housing. If there's any affordable housing built at all at the back end, once the project is approved, generally it's fewer units of affordable housing, and almost always it will be converted to senior affordable housing rather than for families.
And so, Patricia, the system you described, the example you're giving us, what does this do to the demographics of a city? What does the city look like when this kind of local structure is?
So I'm going to pause right here and just let you know you're hearing the interaction between the three different people. One is Kate Waltz, the Senior Director of Litigation, Director of Housing Justice at the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law. Patricia Fraun, the Executive Director of the Chicago area for Fair Housing. And there's one other person. I'm trying to look at it real quick so I don't have to slow us up too much to take a look at this. But this is the interaction that's going on. Now, what is interesting about the city of Savannah is that we do have these different boards and commissions. We have a planning commission that takes a look at what's happening in zoning, changes, recommendations as it goes before the city staff, before a recommendation is made to city council. And then the other part that I think is interested in Savannah is there has to be a public hearing process. There has to be a notification process. So it gets to be very interesting on how this notification is placed in these different communities and who actually gets the notifications. One of the things that I have discovered in the city of Savannah is that unless you're considered a stakeholder, you're not really in the know as far as when these public hearings are zoning changes are being recommended or what's going on in your community. And one of the stakeholders recognized is if you belong to a neighborhood association that the city of Savannah recognizes. So that's more for another day. But if you're living in a community and you wonder why you don't know what's going on, it seems after the fact, then it may be as simple as, do you have a neighborhood association? And if there is a neighborhood association, are you engaged in that neighborhood association? There's a process also to serve and participate on the boards and commission. Are you aware of what that process is? So governance and how your city works is very critical as we continue to take a listen here as they talk about the city of Chicago.
Is in place.
The aggregate effect has really been the reduction of land area available for multifamily development through downzoning and the resulting concentrations of family affordable housing outside of predominantly white and predominantly low poverty areas. So it actually shapes what our communities look like. And over the last 25 years, over half of Chicago's wards did not accept even a single multifamily affordable housing unit because of this system that we've created. This also results in increasing rent rates in certain pockets of the city, and it kind of has a reverberating impact throughout the city as a whole. And it ultimately results in the loss of lower income households and predominantly Black.
Well, Patricia, I want to stay with you. So it seems like this kind of hyperlocal control that you're describing is used primarily in white communities. Do communities of color not have the same ability to exert control over their wards?
Well, one of the biggest tools that creates kind of this imbalance in power is what Kate touched on this, constituent committees or zoning advisory councils. We looked at every ward in the city and found that these zoning advisory councils are really concentrated in predominantly white communities, and they have tremendous power, and power not only to determine like the zoning structure of the ward, but also have the power to require developers to jump through a whole host of hoops to gain approval for developments within their wards. So these requirements amount to higher financial investments for the developers that will deter them from even proposing developments in certain wards entirely. And this
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and I don't want to create confusion. So you do need to extrapolate that when you hear the term ward and what we're listening to, you really need to substitute for the city of Savannah, your district. We don't have wards here in Savannah, Georgia, but we do have districts. And how are those districts represented? And in those districts, who has the power, or is that a particular district that is perceived to even have power? What does their constituents look like? What do the people look like in that particular district? Are they getting fair representation? So what's fascinating to me is when I listen and watch the city council meeting, you can, and it takes a while. You've got to be, you've got to watch, unless you just grew up in that world of watching city council meetings, or maybe your majors in political science and it's something you're required to do, or however that is for civic engagement, that you're engaged in the process. But there's a lot in Savannah that's talked about on, making sure that the entire city of Savannah benefits from the decisions being made. But the question that I have for you is that truly happening? And obviously, Savannah is not the only city that has this, these questions and these issues that come up. But since this isn't an election year, how do we create more of a balance? I mean, that is a question that is kind of top of mind for me, because I see the statistics on the poverty rates here in Savannah. I do see the employment numbers. What does that mean as far as how much money are people actually making and the cost of living? So I want you to start thinking in terms of what you're listening to, how that compares to where you're living, especially if you're living in the city of Savannah.
And the same power does not exist to the same degree in also, we notice a glitch in this whole system of aldermanic prerogative overall. When it's used to create or preserve affordable housing, it's often blocked, sometimes by other aldermen and the city's administration. So, for example, there was a recent fight in a predominantly white community for an affordable housing development where the opposition and the support for this development were almost evenly split. But because the opposition group was made up of really powerful local constituents, so notably police officers and firefighters, other aldermen and even the mayor himself circumvented aldermanic prerogative and insisted that the opposition group needed to be heard. So we see that when aldermanic prerogative is used to perpetuate the status quo or segregate affordable housing, there's no controversy, and no one really kind of pays attention to those decisions. But when it's used to challenge the common narrative, it can be blocked.
What we're talking about is one constituency, white people, having access to power and using that to advance their own bias and racial discrimination against protected classes. And so it's not the type of community engagement we would want for a great society. This is where only predominantly white voices are being heard, and what they are raising, however racist, is being honored, and that housing is being blocked. And as Trish alluded to earlier, we see in other communities that are gentrifying, for example, where long-term, predominantly minority residents are trying to preserve some affordability in their communities as they gentrify, and are trying to use their community engagement and their power to influence their aldermen, to work with that alderman to preserve some level of affordability. At that point, we see that it's not true community engagement, because that aldermanic prerogative that's being pushed by that predominantly minority community is not being recognized or honored. So it's only really working in one direction, to block affordable housing. And we believe the recommendations that we are advancing, and that we've seen others advance around the country when they've faced similar issues, are not to remove all levels of community engagement, but to make it objective, fair, and open for everyone, not just for powerful white constituents.
We also see very high market rate residential rents. Is there any support for the theory that downzoning increases rent for market rate multifamily rental units by decreasing the land available for this market rate multifamily rental? I see you both nodding. Kate, you're nodding a little more vigorously. I'll let you take it.
So we worked, I think that's a fantastic point. That there's a broader harm created by a city's downzoning practices, that it's actually driving up the market rents in the area. And we worked with a set of researchers who looked at that and found sort of a similar outcome.
Just that, I mean, this.
So we're listening to this clip that is focusing on what has happened, or, how the city of Chicago is structured, but it's a lot larger city than Savannah. But I think it's interesting to kind of do the comparison and start seeing where do we have the gaps in power in the city of Savannah, because there's a lot of talk about the arena development here, what that means, what is that going to look like. There's a lot of talk about making sure that there's minority business participation. And the question, that comes on my mind is, is that even a fair way to look at it? Because how do you get to that balance of minority participation if there are minority vendors that choose not to participate? It's a very slippery slope, because at the end of the day, as a taxpayer, we are footing the dollars one way or the other. And so that's why the topic and what we're delving in here is where is the connection in the community that you live in between race, power, and politics. And especially you're going to hear more about housing and housing affordability. It's not anything new. It's something that communities have talked about all across the nation. And I hear that conversation occurring a lot in Savannah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. I am going to need to take a little break for a few minutes here to make a couple of announcements, and we'll be back with the One Human Nation show.
This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
This portion of WRUULP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by listeners like you and Brighter Day Natural Foods. Brighter Day is celebrating its 40th year serving the Savannah community with produce, vitamins, and supplements, and a deli and juice bar. Brighter Day is located at 1102 Bull Street at the south end of Forsyth Park. More information available at 912-236-4703 or brighterdayfoods.com.
How many times have you heard WRUU's corporate underwriting message? If you remember it, then your potential customers will remember your message as well. We are offering this space to connect corporate and institutional partners with our loyal and active listeners. Underwriting on WRUU is short, so listeners don't tune out. It's exclusive, so your message won't be lost in advertising clutter, and it supports Savannah's only community radio station. For a marketing package to increase your reach beyond traditional media, email underwriting at wruu.org.
The Neighborhood Improvement Association offers free tax preparation by IRS certified volunteers for low and moderate income residents at various locations in Chatham and surrounding counties. For more information, visit naicdc.org or call 912-447-5577.
WRUU 107.5 offers Savannah's most diverse radio programming. This evening from 7 to 8, Here It Is Tomorrow presents almost popular, no longer popular, and never was popular music. From 8 to 9, Crucial Rhythms features dance hall and reggae. From 9 to 10, Rigor Mortis brings you rockabilly, psychobilly, surf, and swing. And from 10 to 11, Route 66 highlights American rock as a window into the nation's culture. Find our full schedule at wruu.org.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. So we are, hopefully engaging in some things to make you start thinking about as you hear on the local level from different politicians, because we don't make a stand on WRUU on which politician you need to endorse. I definitely recommend that you get engaged in the process, but sometimes that can get to be very difficult if you don't do your research ahead of time, if you don't ask questions, if you don't learn, if you don't observe, if you don't listen, and, talk to different people that have a different point of view. And I think that's what makes it so tough when we really start trying to figure out what decisions to make, because it's like anyone you talk to, depending on which candidate they're endorsing, has a different point of view. So at times it gets to be very difficult unless you have gone through your own process of becoming educated about the candidates, about the topic, about this, your community and what's important. One of the things that I will mention to you with the city of Savannah is that it does have a comprehensive plan. And that is one of the things that the Alderman Council body, along with the mayor, have looked at or should be looking at to determine how are dollars being spent, because that was part of the community process. Now, what gets to be interesting about that is sometimes when these community meetings are happening, it's like the last thing you want to do at the end of the workday is go to a community meeting. I've been very impressed with some of the community meetings I've been to in my community, of the level of attendance, and I think it's important that engagement happens, so we don't listen to only one segment of the community, that we're listening to a diverse group of the community, people that work, people that are retired, people that have wealth, and people that may not have as much wealth. And that's where I think it gets to be difficult, because everyone comes to the table with what they consider to be important to them. So as we continue to finish up, I think, this little portion, just to give your thoughts on thinking about, what do you need to engage with as you start seeing candidates come forward locally in Savannah, because it is an election year? What message are you hearing? How does that tie into the comprehensive plan, and how does that fit into the community that you live in? So I'm going to take a little listen. We're going to take a little bit more listen to this particular clip that was from the city of Chicago, but there is another bigger picture about housing and affordability And this whole concept of NIMBY, which is not in my backyard, that everyone, wants to address. I mean, no one wants to see an investment in their community that turns out to be a slum of tomorrow. And so there's been some interesting dynamics that have happened in Savannah, that communities that were predominantly, or if not all white, when I grew up here, are now predominantly African American, and the shift in what that has caused in that community, in the infrastructure there, everything from what's the school structure look like, the school performance look like, to housing and maintaining housing and affordability. So it's really, I know it sounds complex, but when you start peeling back the onion, it really does get down to how is your city governed? And how are people recognized, and who is recognized? What are the power dynamics, and how do you engage in that process? Where do you need to create alliances with people that may not always vote the same way that you vote, but are they on the same page with some of the other items? Because I think it's very difficult to find one candidate that's always going to be 100% in your corner of how you look at things. And then that's where it gets to be very difficult in the decisions that we make. So let's continue to take a listen, and then we're going to take a listen to this clip from The Power of an Illusion, how the racial wealth gap was created in this country as it relates to housing and housing affordability and residential segregation.
I mean, this literally shapes the city. The use of downzoning, it has this reverberating impact throughout the city. And I think it's perpetuated this idea that there are areas of the city that are for the rich and there's areas of the city that are for the poor, and that's just how it's always been. When that's really not the case. There have been these system-wide forces that have changed communities like Lincoln Park that have been once affordable.
So I think this is a good place to pause, because I'm noticing the time, and I do want us to get this particular clip in. This is from a documentary that was done. It's out there. It's excellent. If you get the opportunity, it's entitled "Race: The Power of an Illusion." It airs sometimes on a PBS station, but this particular segment is breaking down how the racial wealth was created around race and local politics, and to start thinking about how does that impact housing in your city, and for me in the city of Savannah, and what does that look like as far as residential segregation. So again, this particular clip is from Race: The Power of an Illusion.
But perhaps the best example of how European ethnics would finally gain the full benefits of whiteness came with an innovation in housing at the end of World War II. It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
Living space was at a premium. When in the Bronx, they tried building Quonset huts, and they turned to slums. All the Quonset huts had just disintegrated. There were two families sharing a hut. One family at one end, one family at the other, and before you know it, they were awful.
FHA came to the rescue by ensuring long-term, low monthly payment mortgage loans.
Veterans needed homes for families. They turned to a revolutionary New Deal housing program. It would racialize housing, wealth, and opportunity for decades in ways few could have imagined.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Due to the stimulation of the National Housing Act, from every section of the country come reports of vastly...
In order to purchase a house in America prior to 1930s, you had to pay 50% of the sales price up front. The new terms of purchasing a home was that you put 10% or 20% down, and the bank financed 80% of it, not over 5 years, but over 30 years at relatively low rates. This opened up the opportunities for Americans to own homes like ever before. The average person could own that home.
If these terms sound familiar, they should, because this is essentially the same financing scheme that allows most Americans to own their homes today. Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. On the outskirts of Baltimore, Memphis, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, and other cities, brand new communities sprang up. One of the most famous was a Long Island potato field, transformed into 17,000 new homes. It was called Levittown. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
You have to remember the people who came here in 1947, 1948 were young ex-GIs whose uppermost concern was taking advantage of the GI Bill and making things better for themselves.
Before moving to Levittown, Herb Callisman and his wife Doris lived in a cramped attic apartment in New York City.
And when we began to look for an apartment, we found that the apartments were $100, $125, $150 a month. I know that's unbelievable today, but it was too expensive for us. And out here in Levittown, the mortgage payments was $65 a month.
Your kitchen dazzles every eye. A brand new sink, a built-in oven, a new refrigerator, and a...
If you were buying a Levitt home in 1947, 48, 49, 50, and 51, you would get, this would be your kitchen. You would get a GE stove, GE refrigerator, and a Bendix wash machine. It would be part of the real estate.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
One of the questions that I think about when I think about how housing and owning a home and home ownership created wealth for many in this country, Savannah was also interesting in how it developed housing for African Americans. And so if you know your Savannah history, and I think that's really important to start looking at where are these subdivisions, where were these developments, how is it shaped today, and in which districts do these development fall within? How does that shape the way that Savannah manages through the politics of Savannah? Because you will hear people say, well, Savannah has a lot of old money. And it's very interesting to hear that, that Savannah has a lot of old money. And so what does that mean? And how does that shape how things are being done in Savannah, and how, if there's a reason to make those things change, what needs to happen in order for that change to happen? And do we have the politicians either in place now or running for office or looking at being reelected? Is it going to keep the status quo, or are things going to actually change? And that's where it gets to be interesting for me, because I've mentioned before, I moved away in the early 80s. This was before SCAD was in the city, and the city of Savannah looks a lot different than when I, graduated from college and moved away from Savannah and visited all the time because I still had family here and loved it. But it's a difference in living in the city and visiting the city. And so as I get deeper and deeper into living in the city, not only do I look at what can I do to preserve the legacy in my community, but how does that contribute to living in the city of Savannah, and how is that all connected? And so I think one of the key critical components of that I will be taking a closer look at is the districts. There's, what are the districts in Savannah? How does that break down between the city of Savannah, and how do those districts overlap in Chatham County? Is there overlapping? And some of the disconnect or the conversations that have happened before is the separation of services between the police departments, between law enforcement, and what did that mean for also then the fire department? Was it handled by the county or was it handled by the city? And so it's very interesting in how those county residents may look at things a little differently from people that live in the city. And actually, when I grew up in Savannah, it was in the county. It was not in the city of Savannah. And so there is another part of the city, actually it's not part of the city, that they're looking at whether they should form their own city, or should they take another route, and that's Skidaway Island. So it is important to know how the process works, how it's structured. It can be overwhelming. The question is, when you decide to engage, and I think we all have to if we live in the city, no matter what city you live in, whether it was the city of your birth or the city that you moved into, what are you doing to contribute, and what can you do to make a difference? Well, we're getting ready to wrap up today's show. So once again, thank you for listening to the One Human Nation show. And as we continue to move forward, remember that if you want to contact me, the best way to do that is via email at onehumannation@gmail.com. I've had a couple of weeks, the past 2 weeks, the past two shows were recorded shows because I was very much engaged and still am engaged on some things in my community, but I needed to focus on those. And as those things have been taken care of, as we continue to build community, and just for me to get reacclimated to the community, I try to focus on one or two manageable things at a time so I don't get overwhelmed. So you're going to hear more about our discussions for the One Human Nation show and the questions that we've posed before, as far as some of the reflection questions. I'm not going to repeat those right now because actually I'm going to add one more, and that's going to be, how do you think politics and racism is connected in this country. So that's going to be added to question 4. I will be posting the recorded show, and now that this is a live show again, and I will be recording a recorded show. There are some guests that I'm lining up to talk more about some of the systemic issues that we have with our medical system, with our high infant mortality rate for African Americans, and just some things that hopefully makes all of us think about what kind of place are we creating for everyone, and what does that look like, and how can we make a difference and make the change. So I'm going to get ready for Mr. Troy Stoner with Sound Limits. I see that Troy is in the house. So as I transition out, I hope you continue to have a great week and do your due diligence, ask questions, observe, learn, and be open to this journey that we're all on if we want to engage in creating a better place for everyone. And what does that look like? What does that feel like? Once again, you've been listening to the One Human Nation show, and have a fabulous week.